Have you used BetterHelp or other similar mental health apps? Have you heard an ad for one of those mental health apps? Well, you won't be hearing an ad here, and I'm going to tell you why. My name is Brittany Page. This is the Page Perspective. Thank you so much for being here. I also want to say thank you for the positive feedback and comments that I received for the interview that I did with Dr. Chris Hoff, the Radical Therapist, on YouTube and on his Radical Therapist podcast. We got amazing feedback, comments, emails, all of it. Please keep it coming. Anything to feed the algorithm, the likes, the comments, all of it helps. Make sure you're subscribed. And if you want to support me, that has come up a lot. People have asked, am I going to have merch? At some point, I will definitely get on that. But the best way to support me right now is, of course, liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing the video with a friend, but also Patreon. Patreon is a great way. Patreon.com/IDoubtItPodcast. So, many of you know that I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California and here where I live in Washington, D.C. I have a Master of Science in Clinical Psychology, and this is why my first interview on the channel was with Dr. Chris Hoff. I had the privilege to work with him at the mental health clinic that he runs in Orange County, California Family Institute. I spent my formative training years there. And during my interview with him, we criticized apps like BetterHelp, and some questions came in about that specifically. So I want to talk a little bit more in depth about what exactly my problem is with apps like BetterHelp. And it starts with this article that I came across in the Wall Street Journal titled "The Failed Promise of Online Mental Health Treatment." And they talk about the surge of mental health treatment apps during the pandemic when access to in-person treatment was super limited and these apps really served a purpose. But instead of prioritizing the need for effective treatment, it appears that these apps have instead prioritized profits and growth. And I want to read from that article now. Many of the businesses, however, put a premium on growth. Investor-backed, they deployed classic Silicon Valley tactics, such as spending heavily on advertising and expansion, while often using contractors instead of employees to control costs. A strategy designed for mundane businesses such as food delivery, the formula can be badly suited to the sensitive activity of treating mental health problems. So you can see how this might be a problem, right? I mean, this also helps explain why you've likely heard an ad for BetterHelp on one of the podcasts that you listen to. There are some podcasts I listen to where I hear an ad for BetterHelp on every single episode, and it's in part due to the priority that they have placed on spending on advertising. And I have actually turned down offers from BetterHelp to advertise for them because I saw problems with it early on, and I feared that the problems would get worse. Now, I'm not here to say that there's no value in BetterHelp. I'm sure that there's people watching this video who say, you know, I use BetterHelp or I have used BetterHelp in the past and it was fantastic for me. I'm so happy that that is the situation for you. Unfortunately, it's not the situation for everyone. And this article specifically highlights cases from people who had terrible experiences with BetterHelp. In one case, there was a man who specifically requested a therapist who specialized in LGBTQ plus issues. And he wrote that on his intake form. And instead of being matched with a therapist who specialized in those issues, he was matched with a counselor who practiced Christian counseling. And this client sought counseling after being kicked out of his house when he told his family he was gay. From the article, his biggest concern was he missed his family. The therapist he was given, he says, recommended he try to stop being gay so he could go back to them. He said, if I chose to go back to who I was and deny those feelings, he could get me where I needed to be. He said, either you sacrifice your family or you sacrifice being gay. I needed someone to tell me I was gay and that was okay. I got the exact opposite. BetterHelp declined to comment on the client's experience, citing patient confidentiality. The therapist wouldn't discuss him either, citing the same reason. Now, another client in this article talked about their experience with TalkSpace, which is another one of these mental health treatment apps. His TalkSpace therapist quickly struck him as unprofessional. During their first session, he said the therapist was switching between rooms in her house before ending up on a couch with a kitchen in the background. There was someone walking behind her during parts of the session, he recalled. She did the second session from the passenger seat of a car. Partway through, they stopped for gas. I could hear the driver get out of the car. I could see the gas pumps. What upset him, he said, was the therapist seemed distracted. It doesn't seem like she's in a place where she can listen to me intently. The therapist said she'd had to move in temporarily with her mother, with whom she shared an office. She said she wears headphones so no one can hear what clients are saying. No. Not cool, not good enough. Listen, during the pandemic, when I was working as a therapist, we had to transition to telehealth temporarily. Everyone remembers the initial shutdown. We thought it was going to be for 2 weeks. It turned into much longer than that. Everything was moving and we had to be very flexible. One of the things that was important in transitioning to telehealth was to ensure as much as possible that the telehealth sessions, this is what I'm talking about, video sessions with your therapist, mirrored as much as possible actual therapy sessions. So this means you can't be running errands during the therapy session. You can't be eating a meal. It needs to be the therapist and the client, whoever is the client, if there's, a couple or there's a family, whoever is supposed to be in the therapy session, those are the only people that are in the room. It needs to, as much as possible, mirror an actual therapy room setting. And it's hard to create that, especially in the beginning when things were so uncertain and we didn't really practice telehealth therapy as much as we do now. But it's important to try to recreate that. And that is just not happening. And there's a lot of problems in this article that go beyond what you're seeing here with these unethical practices. I mean, from pouring millions of dollars into advertising instead of fair pay and effective training and supervision for clinical staff, which then leads to therapists taking on too many clients and providing inadequate and harmful care, which can cause many potential harms. I mean, you're talking about people who are needing access to mental health treatment. Maybe this is their first time reaching out to get mental health treatment. And if they have a negative experience, it could reduce the likelihood that they will ever try again, that they will ever ask for help again. And that's terrible. So we see these unethical practices. We see an apparent lack of oversight, a lack of care, a lack of attention to effective matching what a client puts on an intake form to what a therapist specializes in. There's a lot. And I want to reiterate that I understand these apps can be helpful to some people, especially when the pandemic first happened. But there's a lot of problems here that I'm very concerned about, as are other professionals in the field, like Dr. Chris Hoff. And if you missed the interview, I want to play the segment with Dr. Chris Hoff where we talked specifically about BetterHelp. Well, I think this is also related to some of the concerns that you initially expressed about the therapy apps that popped up, especially during the pandemic. And I've long been critical of the therapy apps like BetterHelp, and I think TalkSpace is another one of them. I was primarily critical of them because I don't know that they can be an effective substitute for being in the therapy room and the work that actually happens in the therapy room. I hope that they would be effective, like during the pandemic, especially in providing access to people who otherwise were not able to seek treatment. I recently read an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was titled "The Failed Promise of Online Mental Health Treatment." And they basically describe the unethical therapist practices on the website. I mean, from people like walking around and like getting gas and being in a car with someone else during a therapy session, which I mean can happen off of BetterHelp too, but there was a discussion of lack of reasonable pay that, prompts therapists to take on too many clients on the app. They've poured millions of dollars into advertising rather than fair pay or effective training for supervision or for clinical staff that they're hiring. There are many problems, as I see it, with the therapy apps. What are some of your concerns when it comes to these therapy apps?
I think primarily is, two things. You did mention it. I think, well, first of all, whenever extractive capitalism is involved, it's going to be problematic, right? And whenever you have venture funded mental health apps, there's always going to be a pressure to scale, a pressure to monetize, those kinds of things. So, what gets lost in that? And I would argue that the actual the stated function of the apps, to support people, that ultimately isn't the number one priority. The number one priority becomes scale and monetization, and you do that through, we've heard complaints about privacy, people's data being sold to third party vendors, lack of confidentiality. The fortunate thing, what I see happening is, and I think, it makes sense to me, is that you're starting to see MAUs, or monthly active users, dropping. Downloads of mental health apps are dropping after the spike in the pandemic, and that made sense, right? Everybody was scared; they didn't know what was going to happen. People were isolated in a particular way, and they reached out to these apps thinking that they would be helpful, and I think they found out that that's not really the case. They're not finding them that helpful, and so you're starting to see investment in these apps beginning to drop. You're starting to see mergers and acquisitions happening. Apps are being combined. And that's all a function of capitalism and the venture funded piece of it. I think the other thing, the scale thing, isn't going to work with those things. As we both know, and you just mentioned, there's not a lot of good therapists out there. So how are you going to scale it? And unfortunately, that's, sorry, you can at me whatever you want, but there are not a lot of good therapists out there, and the more you have to bring it in. So you're seeing these apps actually pivot too, to move to coaching or to peer counseling or something like that, because they're realizing they can't scale it the way they need to scale. And so it's just I think it's kind of turning into a mess.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to touch on that comment you made. There's not a lot of good therapists out there, but before we do, we have a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. I'm kidding. We do not have so
That was good.
one of Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I would love to know your thoughts on these issues. Have you used BetterHelp? Was it helpful to you? Was it not helpful to you? You can call, leave me a voicemail, 657-464-7609, or you can send an email to idoubtit@dollemore.com. You can support my work on Patreon, patreon.com/idoubtitpodcast. And thank you so much again for being here with me today. I appreciate all of the comments, likes, subscribes, everything that you can do to feed the algorithm, and take care. I will see you next time.